All right, so this is episode 7 of Deck Profiles for the Brilliant Stars to Surgeon Sparks format. Uh, I've been saying that, since Prismatic Evolutions came out, it's not really the introduction of a new format, although, there are some pretty influential cards that came out, such as Badu and Regigigas, but not necessarily the ushering in of a new format, so it's just an extension of Surgeon Sparks format, right? So, maybe before I begin, uh, maybe I'll announce now that maybe I will cover some lists centered around some of the new Prismatic Evolutions cards. But the reason why I've just been keeping away from it is because, uh, basically, like, if you're pretty familiar with the Pokemon trading card game, you can just glance over kind of the set list for Prismatic Evolutions and realize, none of these decks are meant to, you know, be a big influence on the format, let alone do they have the potential to. So that's kind of the reason why, is that these decks are not supposed to, you know, swing the meta too much. Okay. Honestly, there are some pretty interesting cards in Prismatic Evolutions, such as Umbreon EX. But besides that, um, there isn't really a reason to try to like obsessively deck build over Prismatic Evolutions cards. So yeah, that's kind of why I've been keeping away from it. Um, so this deck profile video is gonna be about Alakazam EX, and so Alakazam is a stage 2 psychic Pokemon that was printed in it was printed in 151, and it was received very well by the community because it was the first attack. It was the first Pokemon to get an attack that could be used from somewhere other than active, and so that was pretty hype in general. And so this card got a lot of attention when it came out, right? But this was printed in 151, right? Which the set that came out before that was Paradox Rift, and so the format for Scarlet and Violet was pretty much still in its infancy, and Charizard had just come out, so Charizard's dominance kind of weakened the release of this card, basically, right? So yeah, this card never got really the time of day, hasn't really seen much success, and it's not necessarily because this card isn't good. It's just because it didn't really get the format. It didn't get really released in the right format, and also just it was a pretty complicated card to sort of try to build around as well, right? So, um, honestly, this card is a very good archetype, in my opinion, right? It has the same stat line as Gardevoir, 310 HP, Psychic Pokemon, weak to Dark, but its stat line is actually better because it has 2 attacks instead of one, and it has 1 retreat cost, right? And so overall, I would say that just in a vacuum, this card is probably just like a better version of Gardevoir, right? And I'll explain more as I go into this video. Obviously, I'm not saying, oh, drop all your Gardevoir decks and start playing Alakazam. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that on paper, Alakazam is a better card than Gardevoir, right? Can attack from the bench, 1 retreat cost. Its attack does more damage. Its main attack does more damage than Gardevoir's main attack. And so, yeah, overall, the card is better than Gardevoir, right? On paper, right? But basically, Alakazam is like the thing about Alakazam is that because this is the first time this has been seen in Pokemon trading card game, we don't really know kind of historically we don't really know how to approach this card, right? Generally, how the Pokemon trading card game has been approached is that sort of similar to how the game is approached, right? And it's not supposed to be approached that way, just to make a quick caveat. But that's just how Pokemon has been approached, right? You just take the strongest Pokemon and you just run people over with it until they figure out how to stop you, basically, right? That's generally what we've seen in Pokemon game and the Pokemon trading card game as well, right? So we have cards like in this format, you're pretty familiar with this format. You got Charizard, right? You got Lugia and Friends, right? And now recently Regidrago, right? Um, Cards like Dragapult, and kind of that's how people play the card game, right? And teach their own, right? But if you followed Pokemon long enough, and you're even following like VGC these days, um, you realize that a lot of innovation has come to sort of um, prevent people from doing stuff like that, right? And so we see situations where you know a lot of Pokemon on people's teams aren't even like Pokemon that can really do things that cards like our Charizard and Lugia can do, right? Where they can just set up and one shot you and just run your whole board over, right? Like you see Pokemon like a Mungus with high meta share. Pokemon like Incineroar, right? And so in a game like VGC, you know, it's much easier to innovate considering uh there's less of an odds factor to influence games, right? And compared to a trading card game where odds play a big role in the power level of decks, right? Um, so that's kind of what um makes Alakazam and what has basically struck Alakazam in terms of like a sort of a weakness for it, right? Is that kind of novel strategies in card games don't really get jumped on too quickly, especially with how far card games have come, right? So this card's pretty hard to understand. We'll just go through it real quick. Has the first attack Mind Jack, 2 colorless energy, does 90 plus. This attack does 30 more damage for each of your opponent's bench Pokemon, right? So, you can have, without something like Area Zero Underdepths, you can have max 105 Pokemon on your bench. So 30 times 5 is 150 plus 90 is 240, right? So this thing can do 240 damage max, right? Not gonna really talk about Area Zero math because obviously it can just one shot anything. But yeah, that's its attack, right? Then it has its second attack, Dimensional Hand, for 2 psychic energy, does 120 damage. This attack can be used even if this Pokemon is on the bench. So if this Pokemon isn't active, it only has one attack, Dimensional Hand. but if it's active, it can use its other attack, Mind Jack. Basically, that's the general idea, right? And the reason why they put this on Alakazam, if you're wondering, is that if you know the game, Alakazam came out in Gen 1, and it was basically like the premier psychic Pokemon in Gen 1, right? So its whole theme is like doing like telekinesis and stuff like that. And so, of course, being able to do uh like very manipulative attacks in the card game would fit it perfectly, right? For Pokemon, right? So that's kind of what they were trying to go for. And especially because Alakazam is finally allowed to be, well, not Alakazam, but Abra and Kadabra are finally allowed to be printed in the game. I mean, in the trading card game, after the lawsuit against Pokemon was dismissed. And so, yeah, they really wanted to just start off with a bang, so they gave this thing a very unique attack, right? So that's pretty good for Pokemon. So, yeah, pretty cool. And it's not just I'm trying to explain in this video. I'm going to try to argue in this video that it's not just a promotion for Alakazam and for the card game in general, but they're actually trying to make a competitive archetype through Alakazam, right? So that's its attack. I'm going to kind of explain a way that you can use it in this format, right? So this is my standard Alakazam list for Surgeon Sparks, and it has 3 Abra, and I use the Teleport Abra. There's 2 Abras in this format. There's the Abra for 151, and then there's the Abra from Twilight Masquerade. So I use the one from Twilight Masquerade. It's 40 HP, has the ability Teleporter. Once during your turn, if this Pokemon is in the active spot, you may shuffle it and all cards attached into your deck. Then has the attack beam for Psychic, does 10 damage. Right. So this is a very strong ability in general, especially considering it's on a Pokemon that can evolve too. Right. So just on paper, like I said, Alakazam just has a very high power level. It's a basic, has an ability that can manipulate your board, where you can get free promotions, basically. Um, and this card can do a lot of cool things, right? This card has a lot of potential, and so just this ability alone is just very powerful, right? Um, are you going to be using it this much and too much in this version of Abra? I mean, Alakazam, probably not, but this is just the superior Abra, even though the other one has 50 HP, so it's the one I play. So play 2 Kadabras. Again, the one from Twilight Masquerade has the attack Psychic. It's 10 plus. This attack does 30 more damage for each energy attached to your opponent's active Pokemon. So it just does more damage than the Abra from 151. Just has the attack teleportation attack for 30 damage. And so that's the one we play. Then we play 3 of the Alakazam EX. Yeah, it's just so that we can hit them. You're probably only going to set up 2 max in a game. So you only need 3 max. So play 3 copies. And so the Pokemon that kind of revolve around Alakazam are Klefki from Scarlet and Violet base set, 70 HP Psychic Basic, has the ability Mischievous Lock. As long as this Pokemon is in the active spot, basic Pokemon in play, both yours and your opponent, have no abilities except for Mischievous Lock. It has the attack Joust. For colorless, that's 10 damage. Before doing damage, discard all Pokemon tools from your opponent's active Pokemon. Okay, so attack, these ability types are generally known in the card game as ability lock, And so ability lock is very powerful because a lot of decks don't really play around trainer cards to set up. They usually play around like abilities. So being able to turn off abilities, especially basic Pokemon abilities, is very powerful effect. And comboing it with the Alakazam EX basically makes it so that you don't have to uh, attack with Alakazam in active. So you can put up an ability lock and you can actually attack as well, right, with a decent amount of damage. So that's the first Pokemon that revolves around Alakazam. And then the second Pokemon is Mimikyu from Paldea Evolved. Has the ability Safeguard, prevent all damage done to this Pokemon by attacks from your opponent's Pokemon EX and Pokemon V. Then it has the attack Ghost Eye for Psychic Colors, with 7 damage counters on your opponent's active Pokemon. Right, so again, since you don't have to have Alakazam in the active to attack, you can just push Mimikyu and Pokemon EX can't damage it, right? And since most decks that are meta attack with Pokemon EX, you can set up a board state where it's very hard for your opponent to take a knockout without using something like Boss's Orders or something like that, right? So that's the second Pokemon that revolves around Alakazam, and then we have third Pokemon that's going to be inactive, is Tatsugiri. Twilight Masquerade has the ability to track customers. Once during your turn, if this Pokemon is in the active spot, you may look at the top 6 cards of your deck, reveal a supporter card you find there, put it into your hand. Shuffle the other cards back into your deck. Right. So basically, this card is just going to be our main way of setting up. So it can serve a dual purpose where you can use it to set up, and then after it's after you've got set up, you can just leave it inactive, and you can just attack with Alakazam from the bench, basically, right? So although you're gonna need this card to keep getting supporters and stuff like that, generally after you set up, you can just basically set up attack combos where you attack with Dimensional Hand first, and then you can just push Alakazam and use Mind Jack afterwards. Right, so that's generally kind of what you want to accomplish with this card. Right. So we also play Radiant Alakazam. Has the ability Painful Spoons. Once during your turn, you may move up to 2 damage counters from one of your opponent's Pokemon to another one of their Pokemon. So I've gone over this card already. If a Pokemon is damaged on your opponent's board, you can move 2 damage counters from it to another Pokemon on your opponent's board. Right. Has the attack Mind Ruler for Psychic Colors, 20x. Attack does 20 damage for each card in your opponent's hand. So, not generally going to be using this card for its attack, obviously, but if your opponent can get up a big hand size, then of course you can swing away with Mind Ruler, right? And since it's a one prizer, it's a pretty effective attack as well, right? But generally, this card is going to be used to fix math numbers that Alakazam wouldn't be able to hit normally, right? Um, then we play Manaphy from Brilliant Stars. Has the ability Wave Veil. Prevent all damage done to your bench Pokemon by attacks from your opponent's Pokemon. So it's basically what's called bench barrier in the trading card game. So this deck has a lot of very low HP basic Pokemon. So you want to use something like this so they can't use an attack like Moonlight Shuriken. So they can't knock out your whole board with one attack, right? And then from certain sparks, you play this card Smoochum. It's a baby Pokemon, so it's 30 HP for your retreat. Uh, it has the attack for free. Delightful Kiss. Search your deck for up to 2 basic psychic energy cards and attach them to one of your bench Pokemon. Then shuffle your deck. So this is basically just your energy acceleration for the deck. Um, I didn't mention it when I was discussing Alakazam, but Alakazam is basically a control type deck, right? Just based on how the card is designed, it's not meant to be something like a like a combo deck or something like that. And so you're not gonna want to try to cheat an attack into play or do anything like that. You're trying to slow your opponent down so that you can set up, and then you can slow your opponent down more and use that time to basically uh, essentially cheat out a win. Basically. That's what control decks are trying to do, right? They're not trying to win in a traditional manner. They're trying to basically cheat out wins. And so you don't want to try to lean into a strategy where you're trying to set up your board and then you're trying to set up your board and you're trying to slow your opponent down at the same time. If a deck was able to do that very effectively, it wouldn't be a very fair deck. And so that's why we don't see a lot of decks like that where they're control type decks that can slow your opponent down and set up at the same time, right? Unless of course you're talking about Charizard, right? But Charizard is an exception to the rule, right? So this is your energy acceleration for the deck. Basically, the idea is that you can get this card out early, and then you can put two energies on an Alakazam. I mean, on an Abra, and then you can attack once you get to Alakazam, right? And the final card we play is Bibero from Brilliant Stars. Has the ability Industrious Incisors. After your turn, you may draw until you have 5 cards in your hand. So this card is very good. I mentioned it in a previous video. This format, uh, that Industrious Incisors is a very strong draw support, but I would recommend it only in like control decks mainly, um, and especially in this deck. This deck is very strong in that its active Pokemon doesn't really matter that much, and so this card is less of a liability in this deck. So your opponent can't just push this Pokemon up with a boss's orders and then just bully you basically, right? So this card is probably the card you want to use as draw support in this deck. And since it's a stage 1, you can actually sort of play around setting this card up early and then set up your board with its draw support, right? Instead of trying to set it up after your setup, right? So overall, this is a pretty straightforward Alakazam um, Pokemon line. Um, and I think after I'm done explaining the trainer cards and energy lines, I'll try and get into sort of what the rationale is behind Alakazam in general, right? So play 4 Buddy Poffin. Search your deck for up to 2 basic Pokemon with 70 HP or less, and put them into your hand. Put them onto your bench and shuffle your deck. So basically, every single Pokemon in this deck has 70 HP or lower, and so this card is very effective in this deck. So you play 4 copies. Other search card we play is Ultra Ball. Play 4 copies. Uh, and then we play Energy Search, right? So this card reads: search your deck for a basic energy card, reveal it, put it into your hand, shuffle your deck afterwards. So again, this deck doesn't really have strong uh, energy acceleration. So having a lot of outs to your energy is very important, basically, right? And so you just want to play as many as possible. And so this card comboed with this supporter card, Arvin, is very powerful, right? So The supporters we have is Arvin. Play 4 copies. Search your deck for an item card and a tool card. Reveal them. Put them into your hand. Then shuffle your deck. So, um, stage 2 decks in Scarlet and Violet generally um are trying to compete against, when they came out, obviously those battle styles. So they were trying to compete against like decks like Mew and stuff like that. So they needed an effective way to set up. So you have a card like Arvin, which can just search an item card from your deck. And so this deck plays 4 just because you need to set up as quickly as possible, right? So then we play 4 Iono. So Iono in a slow deck like this is very strong because you're going to be able to play a lot. So your opponent is going to need to hit a lot more often than just setting up in one hand and then just being good to go, right? So you play 4 copies, and then for the tools, you play one Defiance Band. You have more prize cards remaining than your opponent. The attacks of the Pokemon this card is attached to do 30 more damage to your opponent's active Pokemon. So Alakazam's attack generally doesn't do that much damage, and so to compensate for that, you play Defiance Band because you're probably going to be behind against most decks. And so, for example, Dimension Hand only does 120 damage, and so it wouldn't be able to 1-2 shot something like a Regidrago. And so, you attach Defiance Band has 150 damage now. Now you can 2-shot Regidrago, basically, right? There's also some other kind of funky math where if you're up against something that has like 280 HP, you can, and they have like a full bench. Mind Jack will do 240 damage, and then with Defiance Band it's 270. And then if you move a damage counter from something else, you can do 280, right? So that's another reason why you play Defiance Band. It's just for funky math, right? We also play Rescue Board. Your tree cards to the Pokemon discards attached to is colorless less. That Pokemon's remaining HP is 30 or less. It has no retreat cost. So uh, the only card this card is really going to get attached to is Alakazam, so that I can retrieve for free. But also, this card's just thematically pretty good with cards like Tatsugiri. So just playing 1 copy is pretty good to go, right? Right. So then we play 2 technical machine evolutions. Choose up to 2 of your bench Pokemon. For each of those Pokemon, search your deck for a card that evolves from that Pokemon. Put onto that Pokemon to evolve it. Then shuffle your deck. Right. So again, this is a stage 2 deck, so it's gonna need to set up quickly. So card like Technical Machine Evolution basically lets you get to Alakazam by turn 2 or Barbaro by turn 1. Right. So play 2 copies so you don't prize one, and then maybe you can draw into one on turn 1. Right. Also combos well with Arvin, so that you can go on turn 1 if you open a Buddy Buddy Poppet, for example. You can go Energy Search and Evolution for your Arvin, and then you can get the energy for the evolution. Right. So then we play 1 counter game. If you have more prize cards remaining than your opponent, you attack to this card is attached to cost colorless less. So the idea is that Alakazam's first attack costs 2 colorless energy. So with a counter game, if you're having trouble setting up, you can attach counter game, and you can just attach 1 energy, and you can use Mind Jack basically to try to get an edge back in the game, right? Generally, not a lot of Pokemon are going to be able to 1-shot Alakazam, so you'll get a lot of value from the counter game, right? So those are the tool cards. Uh, A spec we play on first stamp. Use this card only if any of your Pokemon were knocked out during your opponent's last turn. The player shuffles their hand into their deck, then you draw 5 cards, and your opponent draws 2 cards. So I believe that Unfair Stamp is probably the best ace spec in this format. We have another ace spec like something like Prime Catcher, and I would say that Prime Catcher is the most oppressive ace spec in this format, right? So I say that because Prime Catcher, punishes a lot of decks that are trying to set up, right? And so decks that can set up very quickly, like Regidrago, Roaring Moon, Rage and Bolt, etc., thrive off of having a card like Prime Catcher in it, but doesn't necessarily mean that, it makes Prime Catcher the best ace spec, right? It just means that those decks can use it very well, right? A deck like Alakazam wouldn't be able to use something like Prime Catcher, right? You could easily throw something like Unfair Stamp into any deck, right? Because it's a very powerful effect no matter what deck you're playing, right? That's kind of why I say that Unfair Stamp is the best ace spec. So that's what we play in this deck, and it fits very well into the control theme because it can slow your opponent down very well, right? Alternatively, you could play something like Grand Tree, so that you can set up, your basics um, into their fully evolved forms as quickly as possible. But again, since this is a control deck, you don't want to really set up quickly. You're trying to slow your opponent down, make them use a lot of resources so that you can win later, right? So that's the ice spec I play. The other supporter I play is Boss's Orders. Play 2 copies. So generally, this deck's pretty slow to set up. So the more Boss's Orders, the better. But you're not generally going to be trying to win by using a lot of Boss's Orders to try to take knockouts off the bench. So 2 copies is good. One to slow your opponent down, and then one to maybe take a key knockout. Right, so that's the idea of 2 Boss's Orders. Um, then we play 1 Super Rod. So shuffle up to 3 of in any combination of Pokemon and basic energy cards from the discard pile into your deck. So this deck is pretty high maintenance in terms of the cards that you play. So it's just a very strong card to have in this deck. Play 1 copy because you're not trying to shuffle too much. Then play 1 Night Stretcher. Put a Pokemon or a basic energy card from the discard pile into your hand. So play a lot of strong basic Pokemon like Klefki and Mimikyu. So being able to just grab them back um, just straight from the discard pile instead of having to search them again, it's pretty strong, right? Then we play 1 Pal Pad. This is a control deck, so you need at least 1 Pal Pad in it. Shuffle up to 2 support cards from the discard pile into your deck. Then we play Counter Catcher. Play this card only if you have more prize cards remaining than your opponent. Switch one of your opponent's bench Pokemon with their active Pokemon. Right, so you're going to be behind a lot. So a card like Counter Catcher is going to be very powerful in this deck. Then we play 1 Rare Candy. Um, you only play one because, um, again, you're not trying to set up too quickly. So you're not going to need multiple copies of Rare Candy. You just play the one just in case you can get a really nice cheesy setup. Other than that, you don't need, multiple copies, right? Choose one of your basic Pokemon. Play. If you have a stage 2 card in your hand that evolves from that Pokemon, put that card onto the basic Pokemon to evolve it. Skip into stage 1. You can't use this card during your first turn or on a basic Pokemon that was put into play this turn. Right. And then for the stadium card, you play 3 Beach Court. Um, there are 3 cards of each base Pokemon in play, both yours and your opponent's. It's cardless list. Right. So the idea behind this card is that you're basically trying to keep cycling your basics into active, and so beach court basically facilitates that, and so that's kind of what you're trying to go for. Alternatively, you could play something like artisan, obviously, right? But again, it's not going to matter if you set up and you can't really do anything on your board. So that's why you play a card like beach court, right? This deck has a decent amount of consistency, so you don't really have to worry about making your deck more consistent, more than you just have to worry about playing the game, right? So that's kind of the idea of beach court. Then for the energy line, play 9 psychics, right? So 9 may seem like a lot for this deck, considering you're only trying to set up really 2 Alakazams. But the idea is that basically it's a control deck, right? So you're going to be doing a lot of stuff throughout the whole game. And so to maximize your options, you play a lot of energies so that you can just do a lot of things throughout the game, basically, right? So if you're trying to retreat a Bibero, for example, you can attach 2 energies to it. If you're trying to attack with Mimikyu, you can attach 2 energies to it. If you're trying to attack with Alakazam, you can attach 2 energies to it. And it's not going to really eat into your energy count, right? So that's kind of the idea. Um, I'll kind of try to explain sort of what this list is trying to do. Um, so locally where I play, which is in Toronto, I'm known for playing what's been described as crazy decks. Um, and so my deck building I generally just do on my own. So it's you know not unheard for me to be playing something like you're playing in Sun and Moon. This card, the Moltres Zapdos Articuno from Hidden Fates, right? I played this deck at a League Cup, and yeah, this deck was pretty fun. Probably one of my favorite decks I've ever played. Um, but you look at a list like this, right, and it's pretty standard, right? It's a pretty straightforward list. It's not really trying to do anything crazy, and kind of the angle that I'm trying to take with this list in particular is just trying to make a very straightforward Alakazam list, right? Because like I mentioned in the start of this video, that Alakazam is meant to be a competitive archetype, not meant to just be some promotional card that that thing made. Sort of like some of these cards that they came out in Prismatic Evolutions, right? Like Flareons, Pikachu, other evolutions, right? So it's not some card where it's like, oh, this card is so cool. Let's go play some Lugia, right? It's meant to actually succeed, right? And so a list like this doesn't even look that menacing, right? But if you kind of break it down and understand this format very well, you understand this deck has a lot of potential, right? So one thing that gives this deck an edge which means basically you have a inherent advantage over your opponent, is that you can ability lock, right? And a lot of players have found relative success in the Scarlet and Violet era through using very cheesy and very cheap abilities, such as Miraidon EX's ability, and most recently Fezandipiti EX's ability. Right. So the ability to turn off abilities is a very powerful uh, advantage that you can have over your opponent. Right. You have a combo in this deck, such as Unfair Stamp into Cleft Key Promotion into a Dimensional Hand Knockout. Right. And your opponent cannot use something like Fezandipiti to draw out of it. Right. So that alone just gives this deck a power level that's very slept on in this format, right? This is the deck I was actually gonna like main throughout certain sparks actually because of that, right? Then I started to understand that Pheasantipity isn't really that much of a threat if you can set up a really strong board. So kind of leaned away from this deck. But even still, as a control archetype, should probably be one of the most favorite popular control archetypes, even more than something like Dragapult Iron Thorns, which I feel like is a pretty um average deck to say the least, right? So that's kind of where I'm trying to come from with covering Alakazam. And usually I've been doing multiple deck lists, but the other deck lists that I've come up with um are not necessarily like strong archetypes in and of themselves. Those are what I would call meta calls, basically. They're not decks that you could just play and just do well, such as something like Charizard. They're decks that you would have to really have the stars aligned to do well, right? Maybe that's something I'll cover a little bit more in another video, but I just want to kind of cover Alakazam just by itself and not try to, put out bad data about it and give people the idea that, like, you can just play Alakazam with whatever you want, right? Because this is a control deck, and so it's very restricted in terms of what you can pretty much um, do with it, right? So there's a lot more I want to see about Alakazam, you know, especially like regarding like a lot more other combos that I can do. But maybe I'll cover that in another video. Kind of just discuss that in general. Because I don't want this video to go on too long. Alakazam's a pretty straightforward deck, and so um, just gonna wrap it up. Um, so this is the seventh episode I've made, and Surgeon Sparks is probably the format I've worked on the hardest throughout all of 2024, and um, mainly it was because I was going to Toronto, so I wanted to really make sure I had a good grasp on the format. But yeah, I can make probably another 20 episodes about Surgeon Sparks archetypes, but I just want to um cover ones that need coverage before rotation, so that going into rotation there isn't really a drought of concepts like there is now. And so that's kind of what I'm going to focus on more than anything, is just sort of um, preventing that drought from, you know, making decks like Dragapult Iron Thorns come up and, give the rotation a kind of good luck, basically, right? So, yeah, this has been Alakazam. Pretty cool deck overall, and yeah, kind of look through my list and see what I'll cover next. But that'll be it for this video. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next video.